Sorry. Hello.
Hello.
Can you come in? I'm a little bit confused here now. Right. Sorry.
May I just...
Can you come and sit a bit closer over here, my dear?
Yes.
Sure. Hello.
Really?
Towards me, yeah. Here we go. Right there. Them on?
Yeah.
Wait, that's on. Talk about 6 to 9 inches away from the microphone. When you finish, turn them.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us here at COP29 in Baku. I'm Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, an independent policy research institution headquartered in New Delhi and one of the world's leading climate think tanks. Today we are also joined by two distinguished guests. Mr. Avinash Prasad is Special Advisor on Climate Change to the President of the Inter-American Development Bank. Prior to this appointment in January 24, he was Special Climate Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados and an architect of the Bridgetown Initiative that played an instrumental role in helping to set the international financial reform agenda in recent years. Professor Aarti Gupta is Professor of Global Environmental Governance with the Environmental Policy Group, Department of Social Sciences, Wageningen University. Her research is in the field of global environmental and climate governance with a focus on transparency and accountability and the challenges of anticipatory governance of novel technologies. Today, we stand at a crossroads. The promises made at COP28, while ambitious on paper, left the door open for major emitters to delay real change. COP29 must close that door. This time, we are not here for more promises. We are here to push for three things. First, hold countries accountable. Second, drive real climate finance. And demand meaningful climate action to protect the most vulnerable. 2024, with its heat waves, floods, and climate extremes, shows that ambitious action can no longer be a catchphrase. Our climate accountability matrix, developed at CEEW, has laid it bare. The matrix, which we are launching here today in this Climate Accountability Matrix report, is a first-of-its-kind assessment tool from the Global South that analyzes the performance of all G20 members, the world's biggest economies, in climate aspects across 5 themes and 42 indicators. These go beyond mitigation and include adaptation and means of implementation. We find that most G20 countries fall only into the category of reasonable or limited efforts. There is no clear leader. The US, Canada, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey still exhibit weak commitments and sporadic engagements with international agreements. Even countries making strides, such as Germany or Japan, have room to commit more robustly and reduce their emissions footprint. And in the Global South, particularly India, Brazil, South Africa, are taking vital steps, especially when it comes to renewables. But they also need a deeper push and catalytic climate finance to create more resilient sectoral policies. COP29 must venture beyond conversations. Action must be measured and reported. Accountability must be enforced. So first, we need to accelerate the pace of net zero transitions. Our research at CEEW shows that while developing countries aim to reach net zero on average in 33 years, developed ones are taking 51 years on average. This is not a race that major emitters can afford to run at their own pace. Every year they delay, they claim climate space that is critical for the Global South to meet basic development goals. If we are serious about equity, developed countries must pick up the pace and make immediate deep cuts in emissions and step up their commitments. Secondly, we need to ensure that we have data-driven transparency. Data is more than just numbers, it is the foundation of accountability. From loss and damage to adaptation, the ability to respond depends on a clear picture of what is happening. Yet, as we show in this report on loss and damage transparency, we find that only 65% of reported climate events across all countries, rather 65% of reported climate events across countries lack economic impact data. This rises to 90% for small island developing states and least developed countries. This data deficit isn't just an inconvenience, it hinders our ability to direct resources to where they're needed the most. To build resilience, COP29 must prioritize data systems that give every country, especially the most vulnerable, the tools to track their losses, assess risks, and make informed decisions on their financing needs. And thirdly, we need to get serious about climate finance and deliver real money. No developed country has deposited 100% of the climate funds they had pledged. Developed countries need investments, developing countries, excluding China, need investments totaling $2.4 trillion per year by 2030, including $1 trillion from external sources. Now, as we establish the new collective quantified goal, we must ask, how can we trust that $100 billion promises will turn into $1 trillion of real funding? NCQG must focus on both the quality and the quantity of climate finance flows. And this is captured in this climate finance report that we are publishing. Finance must not only be adequate, but dependable, concessional, and new, not a reclassification of existing development aid. The NCQG must be a $1 trillion commitment anchored in justice and designed to fund real action. And finally, we must protect the most vulnerable. The Global South, particularly low-income countries, are hit hardest by climate extremes. Adaptation efforts receive only 1/3 of total climate finance. And with just $702 million pledged to loss and damage, we are barely scratching the surface of what is needed. The current commitments for loss and damage are a mere fraction, just 1/5 of 1% of what is needed. But look at India's story. There's an energy transition story, there's a development story, and there's increasing climate extremes. According to CEEW's recent findings, India's policies alone are set to reduce emissions by nearly 4 billion tons by 2030 against 2020 compared to a no-policy scenario. This is 1.6 times the European Union's carbon dioxide emissions in 2023. This is ambition in action, but it needs to be backed with adequate resources and climate finance in developing countries in general. Every year, every meeting, every pledge that falls short leaves us in a more dangerous and hotter world. So let's commit here and now to leaving COP29 knowing we made tangible, accountable progress. Thank you. Let me pass on to Avinash Prasad.
Thank you very much. If we are going to save the planet, we have enormous financing needs. As was just said, $2.4 trillion per year of finance to developing countries, probably $1 trillion of that cross-border. Indeed, one of the reasons why the $100 billion target began to lose salience just as it was being met was because it was a number that was not relevant to climate finance needs. What we're doing here at COP29, hopefully, is coming up with a new framework of finance that places the financial commitments as a much more relevant and critical part of the system. We need a NCQG that relates to climate finance needs, a large outer number closer to $1 trillion per year of cross-border finance, and a core number perhaps of a tripling of existing commitments, more like $300 billion, that could help to catalyze those numbers. We're not going to get to those kinds of figures spontaneously, organically. As was said, this requires two sets of countries to make enormous changes. Large, developed, wealthy economies where the consumption of and emissions per capita are much greater than is sustainable from a planetary perspective, 6 or 7 times per capita. They need to make substantial and rapid reductions, which can only be done through policy change. There's another set of countries too, middle-income, developing countries, large countries, whose future energy demands, if not in renewables, will be so large that it will be impossible for us to maintain the temperatures below 1.5 degrees of global warming or 2 degrees. So we need policy change. We need an important role to be played by public finance, by international multilateral institutions, as well as bilateral finance. And that's why transparency is so critical to this whole effort, because it will not happen spontaneously or organically, but through policy. We need transparency on quantum of finance. We need transparency on quality of results and impact. We need to focus as much on the output as we are doing on the input. And so I think that that is something we hope to come out of this COP, not only a more enduring framework of finance, one that is more relevant to climate finance needs, whether that is the total quantity, but also a focus on the transparency of impact and results. We're seeing, amid this enormous financial need, an increasing lack of integrity around some of these numbers. We must come together with common definitions of climate results and climate impact. Finally, one thing I would like to add is that loss and damage, adaptation, mitigation, 3 critical things, but they're 3 different things. The climate finance new collective quantifiable goal is focused on adaptation and mitigation. And I think in trying to get ambition from those numbers, it is going to be made up of finance that is what I might call stretchy finance, concessionary loans, leverageable sums of money that are not types of money, quality of money, that's not actually most appropriate for loss and damage. Loss and damage needs to be grant-based. It needs new tax-type resources brought to bear on loss and damage. And so I would caution adding loss and damage to the NCQG requirement. Focus NCQGs on adaptation and mitigation, maximize the multilateral and bilateral resources, triple those resources to get us at reasonable attempts to finance adaptation and mitigation, and seek separately new and additional sources of finance to help finance loss and damage, and do all that in a transparent, robust way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. Let's turn to Professor Aarti Gupta.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So there are many headline issues at this COP, of course, the NCQG, adaptation finance, loss and damage finance, the mitigation agenda, and Article 6. And as we've just heard, all of these issues are absolutely pressing, but from my perspective, a red line running through all of these contested issues is an accountability deficit in the UNFCCC. So let's take the NCQG, for example, new goal, new promises, and we just heard what those new promises should consist of, what should be in, what should be out, perhaps. But the question, of course, is how to ensure that these promises will be kept. We keep hearing, we heard in the opening ceremony as well, that it matters not what we say, but what we do. But so much of COP29 is still about what will be promised, what will be set into motion. Yet that delivery may or may not follow. And we can call for accountability, and that's what this session is also, of course, about. But a core elephant in the room is that there are few accountability mechanisms in the UNFCCC. And I'd like to flag just 2 points in relation to this. One is, and it's been mentioned, the role of transparency here. It's another sort of headline issue for this COP, that transparency is actually the core UNFCCC accountability mechanism officially. And this is the moment you will have heard that all countries are to deliver their biennial transparency reports, the Common Enhanced Transparency Framework under the Paris Agreement. And these BTRs are supposed to inform the world about progress made on meeting current NDCs in order to help hold each other accountable. And there's a huge push to get these reports from all countries. But the question, of course, is we pin a lot of hope on transparency, but does transparency deliver the accountability that's needed? Has it done so to date? And here, unfortunately, we might have to moderate our expectations somewhat. If you think about climate finance provided so far, self-reporting by developed countries has not yet yielded any clear picture of flows, nor the additionality of climate finance, partly because, and this was mentioned, there's no multilaterally agreed definition of climate finance. Is that going to change going forward? Self-reporting by countries through the transparency framework has also explicitly not been designed to shed light on ambition or the fairness of individual contributions, because fairness of individual contributions is a highly contested political issue which is off the table, it's off the agenda, it's not in the scope of the transparency arrangements. Instead, what the BTRs really prioritize is getting low income, low emission LDCs, etc., all countries to prioritize mitigation-focused reporting, even though their priorities are clearly loss and damage adaptation needs, and reporting on those very complex. So there are functionalities of design in the existing transparency mechanisms, which are where we pin our hopes on accountability. So we have to be very clear-eyed about the fact that meaningful accountability is largely missing in the UNFCCC. So I want to just conclude by pointing to one consequence of this. One consequence is not just that we're not doing what we should and being able to hold each other accountable, but it also opens the door to contemplating risky, untested technologies. So let me conclude by pointing to just one consequential cause of this lack of accountability, and it's lurking in the sidelines, so you may not hear about it. It's not one of the headline issues at COP29, but this is the idea of contemplating, for example, solar radiation modification as a way, dimming the sun it's called, as a way to address unequal climate impacts going forward. And one core reason by those who are pushing for these risky, untested, speculative options is that the UNFCCC context is not delivering on the ambition we need. It's not delivering on the 1.5 temperature target. So we need to consider these risky options. There is serious pushback from Global South countries to this suggestion to contemplate these technologies, for example, from Africa and the Pacific Island states, and I'm happy to share this more bilaterally. But fundamentally, going back to the question of accountability, we need to urgently address the accountability deficits in the UNFCCC, also to avoid consideration of these hugely risky distractions that do not serve climate justice or those most vulnerable to climate impacts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have just over 10 minutes for some questions. So if you could also introduce yourself, sir. And there's a microphone coming to you.
Yeah, my name is Ayyar from Energy Intelligence.
Sorry, you need to hold the microphone a little closer. We can't hear you here.
My name is Ayyar from Energy Intelligence. I had two questions on the on this NCQG. You did mention that of the 100 billion that was promised, it has remained a promise, and there are varying accounts of how much was actually dispersed. And there is no central collecting or transparent mechanism to know what was eventually dispersed. So firstly, what's the guarantee that there's 1 trillion or so, anything is going to come out of that or just remain a promise? That's for one. Second, it seems to me that this Article 6.4 was pretty much shot down pretty fast on day one of the conference and approved. And Mr. Stale said that 250 billion of financing would be available from this mechanism annually. So do you see it as a part of a plan by rich countries to use this and kind of avoid their commitments, which should be largely in the form of grants?
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Prasad, on the NCQG.
So I think the main challenge about the 100 billion today is the fact that the number is just too small. The developed countries use the OECD as a mechanism for collecting information. The OECD has published that this number is over 100 billion today. It took only the last couple of years was it hit. About half of that number, of that 100 billion, comes from the multilateral development banks, the developed country contributions to the MDB, so that's concessional loans or low-cost loans rather than grants. And some people object to the NCQG including that. Although I think if you're going to get to the scale of adaptation that we need, you're going to have a significant element of loans. I think that one of the things we talked about deficits of transparency and information. I think you can believe passionately, as I do, in common but differentiated responsibilities, and believe that we should all have transparent reporting obligations. Under the UNFCCC, the developed countries have reporting obligations, but the developing countries have voluntary obligations on reporting. Let us make obligations for everyone to be reporting these numbers along commonly defined measurements. And the final thing I'd say is we're focusing on inputs and finance, but as was correctly said at the end here, a fair bit of finance is going towards some very crazy, magical illusions and schemes. I think we need to focus on results and impact, and that's even more important than the finance numbers.
Let me quickly answer the other question. From the Article 6.4 negotiations, we see this as still a work in progress in terms of ensuring that the methodologies are rigorous. It is necessary to ensure that the exceptions to the best technology provisions and alternatives to them are rigorous, that reversal risk assessment tools for project developers still needs to be developed. The provisions for post-crediting period monitoring are also silent on requirements in the minimum and the time in terms of the minimum period. So there's a lot that still needs to be done. Yet we should see this in the context of the larger conversation around climate finance. And as Mr. Prasad also said, we need to be clear about the definition. We should focus on actual dispersals, not just commitments. We should focus on not just relabeling existing development aid as climate finance. And we should look at what kind of money is leveraged by the public capital that is put on the table. So whether it is grants, whether it is concessional loans, whether it is de-risking capital that leverages additional capital, ultimately what's delivered is what needs to be counted. Shall we take another question? And all right, please go ahead. There's the microphone, and could we have one microphone ready there?
Thank you so much. It's Victoria Seabrook from Sky News in the UK. The UK is saying that it's back as a climate leader. What would that mean, both in terms of its NDC and what it does with climate finance here in terms of committing to a certain figure, perhaps, or other things that it should be doing to grease the wheels and show leadership? Thank you.
Leadership is required. Leadership is required in setting an ambitious new collective quantifiable goal on finance. We're not going to get ambitious nationally determined contributions on emission reduction in Belém next year unless we get ambition on climate finance. So countries will need to set a tone both for what they're going to do domestically, but also the way they're going to support international ambition. A significant part of international ambition is the international financial institutions in which the UK plays a significant role. And so it could play a leadership role there in making sure those institutions are fully supportive of the finance ambition.
Jayanta?
Thank you. Thank you. Jayanta Basu from Telegraph, India. Two quick questions. One is that you spoke about the kind of expectation from this COP. What is the kind of value? Because it's all about putting money on the table in this COP. And any kind of value, considering the US election result, considering how the UAE dialogue apparently pulled back the discussion yesterday, what kind of value you expect to be on table at the end of 22nd or whatever day the COP comes to an end? Any value in your mind you feel will be there? That's number one. Number two, you also mentioned...
We won't have time for a second. We are just 2 minutes short of the close. Is that okay?
About the loss and damage, about the adaptation finance. Mentioned about the both mitigation and adaptation. Last year, adaptation finance went to loss and damage.
Right.
So any talk, any comment on that?
So Aarti, I'll give you the floor first. If you have a thought on the value and you had a thought on Article 6.4.
No, thank you very much. I know we're running out of time. I think there's immense value to this multilateral process. It's the only game in town, really, and so the integrity of the UNFCCC process absolutely has to be upheld. So I think there's no alternative to that. And I just wanted to comment on the Article 6.4 point that this is also, I think market mechanisms are not climate finance. So it's very dangerous a trend to, I think, conflate those two. And there's also a worrying inclusion, perhaps, of untested, again, novel removal technologies in the market mechanism, 6.4, and that's something to be very, very concerned about. Overall ambition and integrity consequences.
Avinash, 30 seconds before I conclude.
We have a system. The system says that countries are going to have nationally determined contributions of reducing emissions, and that for many developing countries, they need finance. So for the system to work, the number has to be relevant to that question. That number is $1 trillion of cross-border finance. Now, to get to $1 trillion, to make that number relevant and credible, we need a critical core element being led by developed countries. I don't think that number could be much less than 300 billion.
And as I conclude, I would simply say that we have to chase all different vectors and channels of climate finance, building on that core contribution from developed countries. But it also requires a continuing reform of multilateral financial institutions, regional development banks, and development finance institutions in general. It also requires a change in our domestic financial ecosystem so that we can start tapping into capital that is available. And we have to start de-risking at a programmatic level rather than at a project-by-project level. We simply will run out of time if we try and do this one project at a time. So unless we completely reimagine the architecture of climate finance, simply putting a quantitative value would be chasing a dream that hasn't been fulfilled so far. Thank you, everyone who's come, and my media colleagues are here who will share the press release with you, and please tap into the reports we've released here today. Thank you, Mr. Prasad. Thank you, Professor Gupta. Thank you very much. Have a good COP.